I present General George Armstrong Custer and Libby Bacon Custer.
The Union forever, the Union hurrah! Down with the traitors and up with the stars. Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, the Union hurrah! Down with the traitors and up with the stars. Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. Good evening. And welcome. The story of a legend. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, here at the historic University Club of Winter Park, we will look into the legend and the fascinating and adventurous life of, well, myself. Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, and my lovely wife Elizabeth. Here we are, reminded this afternoon that we are in the 150th anniversary of the war between the states. The Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, the War for Southern Independence. 150 years ago, April 12th, 1861, Charleston, 4:30 a.m. Those of you who know General Pierre Touton Gustave Beauregard know what transpired on that fateful day. And here we are, 150 years later, when 620,000 Americans died, killing Americans in America. And we're inspired by their example and their service. Tonight we'll take you back in time, a la Mr. Jules Verne, back in time to the life of myself and my lovely wife, Libby. We had quite a few adventures, and we'll translate for them some of you right now. Yes, back in time. 1839, I was born a young Buckeye in Ohio. By the time I was 10, I had moved to Monroe, Michigan. Monroe, Michigan, I followed some of my dreams to become a teacher. But it was 1856. We had a new president named Buchanan. The Civil War was brewing. Bloody Kansas, Nebraska, John Brown at Pottawatomie Creek. President Buchanan didn't seem to mind. But I had other aspirations. West Point, soldiering, glory on the battlefield. I petitioned to go to West Point to Representative Bingham in Michigan. I also saw a lovely young lady at that moment walk down the street one day, and she noticed me as well, and we'll get to her story in a little while. But in 1857, in the Custer home in Monroe, Michigan, a letter arrived from and it had on its stationery from the House of Representatives of Washington, D.C. And in that letter, Representative Bingham told me that I should report to West Point as a candidate to be a cadet at the United States Military Academy. Signing the letter, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis at the time. Oh, happy day in the Custer household. I immediately went off to West Point. And that's how we'll begin our story. So from West Point to Bull Run. At West Point, it was 1857, as I said, and I got in a little bit of trouble. I did hold the command and the respect of my fellow cadets at West Point. However, I 97 out of 100 demerits. I almost made the foundation list, which is a list that would eventually exit you from West Point. But due to some of my heroics and the camaraderie I had with the men, I stuck around West Point and graduated 34 to 34, but I did graduate. Now, we will talk about some of my other classmates who graduated a little higher in the class. I'm sure many of you graduated higher in your classes, but don't demean me for that. Some of the things they described me as charmingly wild, and again, Jefferson Davis, our Secretary of State, had signed that appointment. And now I'm a Buckeye turned Wolverine. I like my cadet picture. Now, friends with me at West Point, some of my other classmates, included that gentleman on the left. That would become General Adelbert Ames. Ames was a Mainer. He was a Mainer who led the 20th Maine and was the commander before a gentleman named Chamberlain, who you might know of. Of course, led them to victory at Little Round Top. Ames graduated 5 out of 34 in that class. Adelbert Ames would follow me somehow through the Civil War. We both became brigadier generals at 23 years old. Ames went on to live till 1933. Became the last surviving boy general of the Civil War. And by the way, died in Ormond Beach, Florida. This same year as my lovely Libby joined heaven. Adelbert Ames, and over my shoulder is my best friend, Thomas Lafayette Rosser. Now, Rosser followed a different path from West Point, a path to a new country, Confederacy. We stayed in touch, and we met on the battlefield. Some of my early classmates. Now, there were 2 graduating classes to West Point that year, because the war had started, of course. So we rushed off to battle. This was our commander-in-chief in 1861. Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, who had been an amazing commander in the Mexican War. But in 1861, General Scott could not get off the horse or back on it. So as we know, President Lincoln chose McDowell, went through quite a series of generals, McClellan, we'll talk about some of those folks. Old Fuss and Feathers. So in 1861, we went off to a place called Bull Run, and my rebel brethren will refer to that place as Manassas. Bull Run, of course, the creek near the battlefield. At Bull Run, I started one of the many reckless endeavors that I did in my life, a very daring adventure on horseback with my men, and we were able to, you could say, chase off the great Jeb Stuart, who we'll talk about as well. But since at Bull Run, I obviously, the name of Custer made the papers after Bull Run. I was 22 years old. Some of my other associates, of course, in the battlefield, Stonewall Jackson on the left side here as a cadet. Stonewall was teaching at the Virginia Military Academy Institute, of course, when the war broke out. He mystified me his entire life, of course. From the United States Army to the Confederate Army. I wish he was here today. We could look into those blue eyes. They said they could look right through you. Of course, tragically, mortally wounded by his own troops at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Great Stonewall Jackson. Other friends, Jeb Stuart again. Jeb on the left standing with his right hand on the shoulder of Robert E. Lee's son, who also became a general in this war. The other gentleman is unidentified. There's Jeb on the battlefield as a Confederate soldier. There were many Confederate leaders in the cavalry that they compared to Custer, myself. You had John Hunt Morgan. You had Nathan Bedford Forrest. You had Jeb Stuart. We were all flamboyant. We were all dashing. But the one of the Yankees that stands out, that would be me. Some of the young lions here, what we call McClellan's Army, the generals, the officers in 1862. Little Mac, McClellan was in charge of the Army at that moment. President Lincoln got upset with Little Mac. He said, "General, if you're not going to use the Army, can I borrow it for a while?" McClellan didn't like that. But I'm the one with the dog. And maybe you can point out, can you find anyone who's not smoking in this picture? I do have a cigar in my mouth. Interesting shot of the young lions here. This again is McClellan's officers as we were in camp right before the Battle of Antietam. The bloodiest day in military history, September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam. Sharpsburg to you, Rebs. Again, McClellan moved too slow for Lincoln. Actually found the orders that the Rebs were going to use and didn't act on them quick enough. His men found the orders of Lee wrapped in cigars before the battle. Some of you know that story. But he didn't move fast enough. And on that day, September 17th, 1862, 26,000 Americans died on that day. Again, the single bloodiest day in American military history. President Lincoln was not too happy. In this picture, you see the great Lincoln visiting us. I'm in that picture in the back as well. I managed to make it into quite a few photographs. The gentleman in the hat in the back. Oh, the non-regulation hat. President Lincoln came to the battlefield in this very rare shot and gave General McClellan some bad news, that he was going to be replaced by another general. Of course, those of you know the story. We had a Hooker, we had a Burnside, we had a Pope, all generals in the Union that didn't quite make it until we got to a gentleman named Grant. We'll talk about U.S. in a minute. Front page, Harper's Weekly, 1863. This is after Gettysburg. Some of my curious nicknames. Suicide Hunter is not up there. But I did command the pages of all the press in those middle years of the Civil War. Again, I'm 23 years old. My darling Libby. In 1862, we visited New York City. This is a portrait taken by the famous photographer Matthew Brady that most of you are familiar with. And Libby will now tell part of that story of our meeting.
Good evening. I am Elizabeth Bacon Custer, though most everyone calls me Libby. I was born in 1842 in Monroe, Michigan, on the banks of the Lake Erie. But I'm not going to tell you about me right now. That'll be a little bit later. Instead, I really want to tell you another side that you probably don't know about of my dear, darling, departed husband, whose untimely death occurred because of the savage Indians. I know so much about my husband because through the years we wrote reams of letters to one another. And I learned to know the man both inside and out. George Armstrong Custer was born in New Rumsley, Ohio. Both of his parents had been married before, so there were 6 children already. And they were little and young, and they couldn't say Armstrong. So George inherited the nickname of Auntie. He did very well at Stebbins Academy and also at Normal School. He was hired immediately to teach primary school, and that was a wonder for him that he finally had money that he could send home to his financially poor parents. His father, Emmanuel, had wanted him to become a minister, but very early in life, it was shown that he was made for the military. He did get appointed to West Point, and John Bingham was the one congressman that would sponsor him. I wish that I could tell you that he excelled and was the top of his class, but that's just not the way it was. He fought with the Southern cadets, and he was slovenly in his appearance. He wouldn't cut those beautiful golden locks, and he played innumerable practical jokes upon the other cadets. No wonder he finished last in his class.
Thank you, Libby. Elizabeth Bacon Custer, my love. Again, Custer had a last stand. How many of you know of the first stand? The first stand during the Civil War at a battle called Trevilian Station. Here I am in one of my favorite paintings, actually holding the flag at Trevilian Station. Again, a bit unorthodox with the tie. Come on, you Wolverines. I seem to make a lot of reckless decisions on the battlefield, and if fortune does favor the bold, and destiny did champion this young soldier to be a hero, it caught up with me. Those generals who went through eventually were settled on good old Sam Grant. If you knew him well, you called him Sam. Ulysses Simpson Grant. Grant was in Ohioan as well, a Buckeye originally. Some of his men as his West Point picture. Later, after Cold Harbor, some of his men called him a butcher. Cold Harbor, 7,000 Union Yankee soldiers went down in 20 minutes. But he knew he had more soldiers. Ulysses S. Grant would go on, of course, to become the 18th President of the United States. Later and after the war, we had our issues. Some of my reckless behavior didn't appreciate. I had 3 brothers. 2 of them followed me to the war. This is Thomas. I was the oldest. Thomas was next. Thomas got his Red Badge of Courage, if those of you know the Crane novel, which was actually based on the story of Fredericksburg. Crane wasn't a Civil War soldier. However, Thomas got his Red Badge of Courage, a wound, on the battlefield at a battle called Sailor's Creek. It's right before the surrender of the Civil War. My brother Tom. My other brother's name was Boston. We all met our end together. But there's Tom, after his injuries. Myself. See, we called it seeing the elephant. Seeing the elephant in the Civil War meant you saw a battle. You saw a monstrous group of men and artillery and cannon fire and smoke and absolute chaos. You saw that elephant. Tom got to see his elephant at Sailor's Creek. General William Tecumseh Sherman permit me to mention his name, those of you from the South. He said he was going to make Georgia howl. He promised the president he would end this war, steal the soul of the Confederacy, ruin their spirit. And he did. He started up by Chattanooga, and he made a swath of 60 miles through that great state of Georgia. He eliminated everything in his path. Again, apologies. Later, as an Indian fighter, the great William Tecumseh Sherman, I would report to out in the Western Plains. Now, the Civil War, of course, was over within 4 years. On April the 9th, 1865, this took place. And this is the surrender, of course, at Appomattox Courthouse. I made it in a picture. In the back, between the 2 frames. I happen to be there as well. Again, Sailor's Creek happened right before this. And a little bit of a mistake in this painting, there were actually 2 tables. One that General Grant signed on, one that General Lee signed on. But of course, the surrender at Appomattox meant the war was over. Over? We were relieved. But within 5 days of that war being over, our president was shot. It was Good Friday evening, April the 14th. The surrender had been on the 9th. President Lincoln and his lovely wife, of course, Mary Todd, were expected at Ford's Theater that evening. It was on 10th Street in Washington. They arrived late to the theater that night. Lincoln was on his way to see a very famous actress named Laura Keene in a British play called Our American Cousin. He had seen her act before. The president arrived late, his lovely bride, originally inviting General Grant. Grant and his wife were not able to make the show that night. When the president arrived, of course, in the theater, John Wilkes Booth, one of the most famous actors in all of the country at the time, who actually picked his mail up at Ford's Theater and acted on that stage many, many times, of course, mortally wounded the president. This is 5 years since our wondrous victory, and it's Easter weekend. Walt Whitman wrote a poem about the great Lincoln. And he said, "Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, and the prize we sought is won." But Lincoln was gone now. We had to move on. We preserved that Union. The prize was won. But our captain was gone. Of course, Andrew Johnson took over. It's quite a different story. This is a headline from the surrender. Now, 2 years after the Civil War, in 1867, I was already out west, and I got my first taste of the savage hostiles. In 1867, I sent a lieutenant named Kidder with 20 men to Fort Hays to send a dispatch message. Kidder did not arrive at Fort Hays. 2 days later, I sent some men to look. Kidder and his 20 men were found with about 30 arrows apiece in them, stripped completely naked, mutilated on the plains by the fearsome Sioux. That was 2 years after the war ended. I'm 26 years old. That was my first taste of those Indians. By 1874, we were living in Indian Territory, and Libby had accompanied me. We were at a place called Fort Lincoln in honor of our illustrious president. And from that, Fort Lincoln is where we left, and eventually ended up at a place called the Little Bighorn. Before we got there, I had some fun out west. This picture here, of course. Standing next to me in the black, Captain Miles Kehoe, an Irishman who came over to this country and left a war against the English and a potato famine to arrive at a different kind of war in the United States. Miles Kehoe was a good friend of mine. We were hunting partners. He followed me as well to that place called Little Bighorn. Now, I chose this photograph for you to obviously see that we did have some leisurely time out west. But I want you to look in the upper left of this photograph. And you will notice an Indian scout. And his name was Curly. Curly became a best friend of mine. I needed the Indians. I needed scouts. One of my favorite portraits of Curly. You know, there were survivors at Little Bighorn. They were called the Cheyenne and the Sioux. Curly walked away from Little Bighorn with a little help from my friends. Curly is on the left, and this is a grizzly bear. Look at the claws on that animal. Now, I was from Ohio. We don't have these in Ohio. We have black bear in Ohio. So I enjoyed that out there. I was actually hired to give hunting expeditions for the Prince of Russia who visited at the time. Enjoyed every bit of it. Quite an animal. Now, before I mention to you a problem I had with General Grant. Again, Grant wasn't always in tune with some of my reckless behavior on the battlefield and my unorthodox uniforms. And Grant knew, probably in the back of his mind, that I might be taken out someday because of those reckless and daring maneuvers. But if fortune favors the bold, he's championing this soldier. So I told Grant, I'm going to clean up my name or leave my bones on the prairie. That's a Colt 45. We all had those. Incredible American weapon. Sitting Bull. That's how he looked in 1870. Now, in 1876 is when Bighorn happened. And this is the man, of course, who was my main enemy. I completely underestimated this gentleman. But look into his eyes. He was a negotiable Indian. He could sit down at the truce table. We could speak. Here's the route I took in red. What I want you to see here is that we took, on the upper left where the last stand was, we decided that that is where we would stage the battle. The high ground above the river. Now I want you to look to the south. And when you see the river and the words Indian encampment, greatly underestimated the fact that there were almost 6,000 Indians there. 200 were in my command. Let's keep that in mind. Later you'll hear about Captain Reno and Benteen and perhaps the fact that I refused the use of Gatling guns and could have used them. Overlooking the Little Bighorn. I was going to clear my name or leave my bones on the prairie. Sitting Bull you could negotiate with. Gall? No. Leader of the Hunkpapa Sioux. Look in his eyes and see if you think you can make an agreement with this gentleman. The other side of the coin from Sitting Bull, but of course, they banded together their people. Generally, if you look at the story of Native Americans, you may look at these words ambivalence and guilt and it's the way Americans viewed these savage hostiles. Imagine reading in the newspapers of massacres like I mentioned before, of Lieutenant Kidder. Reading in the newspapers of massacres like Little Bighorn. Americans felt annihilation was the only policy. That's our government's policy. Got to get these Indians out of those areas. And of course, when I took my men through the Black Hills after we discovered gold, that's sacred Indian territory. It's a reckless maneuver. At Little Bighorn, again, vastly outnumbered. I told my soldiers to dismount. Dismount your men, shoot your horses, and use them to deflect the weapons and the arrows. So we did. That's me, Annie. Top. The battle flag from the battle. Now these are the men, of course, the officers in my division that died with me on that hill. And in the words of our president, they gave their last full measure of devotion. And some of them I've talked about. My brother Tom. Miles Keogh, the Irishman. All of us were disinterred, eventually buried as officers back home, some of us, myself at West Point. The enlisted men are still on the mountain. So you might know the story of this man, Black Elk, who apparently was 12 years old at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Lived through the battle, also lived to go to Wounded Knee. Lived through Wounded Knee, apparently became a Catholic and was interviewed. Interesting story of Black Elk. Just somebody I'd like to bait you with and think about. But this is one of the survivors of the battle, and again, lived into the 20th century to try to relate the story of the Battle of Little Bighorn for those who weren't there. Black Elk's story is quite phenomenal. We were immediately buried after the battle. Shallow graves. A year later, they came out. Soldiers disinterred us, the officers, and again, my body was taken to West Point to be buried. In this image, you can see mostly horse bones, but there are some human remains in there. Now, I told you there were survivors at Little Bighorn, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, some of the Crow. The only United States 7th Cavalry survivor was this horse. This horse was the property of my friend, Captain Miles Keogh. Comanche survived. You can even see the scars all over her body. She never had a kid a saddle on her the rest of her life. The only survivor of the Battle of Little Bighorn from the United States Army. On the battlefield, of course, we have several monuments, and this is one of them. The captains, enlisted men, soldiers, and so on. Again, look into the eyes of these men. You think 1492, 500 tribes. And here we are, by 1890, after the battle at Wounded Knee, a massacre at Wounded Knee. There's 7 million plus Native Americans who had been here. Were either dead by disease, battle, or on a reservation. Now, they say I'm a legend in my own time. Must be so. I visited one of your local bookstores recently, and someone named Philbrook wrote a book called The Last Stand. It's on your bestseller list. The monument in the Buckeye State. This is my grave at West Point. Libby again eventually was brought and interred with me at West Point. Some of you might have heard this expression. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. And it was said by my commanding officer, General Philip Sheridan. Turns out when Sheridan met Sitting Bull the first time, Sitting Bull approached Sheridan and said, "General, I'm one of those good Indians." Not exactly in that tone. And Sheridan said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Again, the spirit and the government's purpose at this point was annihilation. Get these people on reservations. There is gold in those Black Hills. But there's the man who came with the saying. Here he is, about what he looked like at that time. Now, Sheridan's story is interesting about the desk that was given to my lovely wife. Libby, would you like to relate some of that story?
I would love to.
Appomattox Courthouse.
But I am going to go way back because to me, my dear one, and how we met and how we finally were able to court is very interesting. And of course, those are the days when he was very much alive and very interesting. He did graduate from West Point. The war had begun, and he joined the cavalry, the 2nd Cavalry. He was commissioned as 2nd lieutenant. He couldn't wait to get to Washington to get orders. However, he stopped on the way in New York City, especially to buy a full dress uniform, complete with sash, cutlass, spurs, the whole 9 yards. And then he went on to Washington, and he was told to report to Centerville, Virginia. And his commander was not a very experienced one, General Irvin McDowell. He was given orders to exchange matches with his close by officers and posts, and this was done in the dead of night because it was so dangerous. Also, it was his duty to protect the cannons that were going to be used to fight the Confederates. Well, the post got viciously attacked by the rebels, and the Union soldiers were not very well trained, and most of them were rookies, and they scattered. All but Second Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer. He held his position until relieved by his officers. Now began the great skedaddle back to Washington. They were beaten, they needed to reconnoiter, and they must march to Washington. The weather was miserable, cold, damp, rainy. Almost all the troops came down with fever and chills, including Autry. He was sent back to Monroe, Michigan to regain his health. And now I will tell you a little bit more about my background. I was born to affluent and comfortable and happy parents. Judge Daniel Bacon and Sophia Page. My mother was sad and morose because there had been 3 children before me, and they had all died. She was a sweet woman, and of course was overwhelmed by these mishaps. I did my best to cheer her up. I would play the piano for her, and I spent time with her, even though I did feel overprotected. I was devastated when she died when I was 12 years old, and my father, the judge, was full of sorrow and grief also, and that was made worse by seeing me in such sadness. He decided that the best thing for me was a complete change, and so he sent me to a private school in Auburn, New York. I did love it. I was able to pursue music and art and French and gardening. The last year, I became horribly ill and missed most of my classes, but I still was able to graduate, and I was class valedictorian, which made my father very happy. His spirits had risen, and he had married a very kind, generous woman named Rhoda. And the house was filled with the wonderful bakery fragrances of things that she made for us to cheer us up. And her manner was always sweet and uplifting, and in a very short time, I was able to call her mother. Now, I had thought that I would be a writer when I graduated from school, but times change, and Monroe was teeming with soldiers of every size, race, shape, and color. And I, like all the other 16-year-olds, really wanted to marry a soldier. Well, there were loads of them that came calling, but none of them measured up to my Prince Charming. My father was not terribly pleased about what I was wanting to do. Now, there was one young man that sort of took my attention. He walked up and down our street and entered the Reed House. Now, as it happens, George Armstrong Custer's sister and brother-in-law lived just down the street from us, Anne and David Reed. And whenever George was in Monroe, he would stay with them. Well, I watched him walk, and it was with great elegance. And I watched him ride horseback, and he was extremely handsome. I did see him at one of our church services, and I was disappointed. He was brash and seemed overly confident, but very polite. My father also saw him in the wee hours of the morning, weaving and staggering down the street with the help of another soldier to bear him up from his overindulgence of alcohol. It wouldn't have mattered if George Armstrong Custer's deportment had been perfect, because my father did not want me to marry a soldier. He didn't want me to be a penniless widow. This was such a dangerous profession. So I didn't see the young man for quite some time and assumed that he had gone back to duty. And this was true. He had. Now, the 2nd and the 5th Corps combined forces, and he was under the command of General McClellan. McClellan was impressed with him and wanted him to lead the charge and plan the charge of Manassas, Virginia, Bull Run. And of course, Audie was very pleased to do this. And with a whoop and a holler and a dash of the saber, he just took command and captured the hill and started the famous articles and stories about him. He also rescued a flag bearer and the flag and brought them to safety, even when his arm was shattered by a bullet. He was promoted to captain. Now, he was given a leave again after the fierce battles and returned to Monroe, and we both happened to be at the same party. And I just was in very much awe of this young man who had accomplished so much in so little time, and he was paying great attention to me. I was flattered, and it was obvious that we were both smitten. Audie asked if he could court me, and of course, you know my father's disposition toward soldiers, and he told him no, he would rather that he not keep company with me. Well, we were both very, very disappointed, but we made a pact that we would secretly correspond and write each other. And so we did. And I learned so much about this handsome, wonderful, gallant man, more than most fiancés know about their betrothed, I am sure. And he wasn't afraid to tell me about his faults as well as his virtues. He told me that he had given up alcohol, as he had promised me, but that he did gamble and he did swear because of the tension in Shenandoah and the other battles. We continued writing, and he kept asking me to marry him. And I, of course, had to refuse. I did care for him, but my father and mother, they were a wonderful family, and I couldn't go against their wishes. So Audie and I rather drifted for a little while. He was given leave again, and he came back to Monroe, and we were both at the same party. And I noticed that he was paying a lot of attention to the beautiful belles that were there, and one in particular. And of course, that made me very disheartened. And he noticed, and he asked to speak to me privately. Well, he begged, he pleaded, he did everything to make me want to never leave him. And I couldn't say yes. I would never be happy, even though I cared for him more than I thought. But I couldn't go against my wonderful parents' wishes. I couldn't be happy that way, split in two. So again, we parted, and George went on to the heavy battles, and the next was the Blue Ridge Mountains, which was very fierce. He came upon the Confederates. They battled in cavalry. Then soon it got to be hand-to-hand fighting, and our captain won. He took the hill, he held it, he had 100 prisoners in hand, and also the rebel flag. Well, besides that, he gathered up a soldier who had fallen, actually the flag bearer, and he took him to safety. George now was made Brevet Brigadier General of the United States Volunteers. Of course, we appraised my father of these wondrous goings on, and he did relent. He said we could write each other, and now we could write without guilt. Audie asked me in several letters if I would please marry him, and very soon the battles were getting more and more fierce, and he wanted to be married. I ordered silk from New York, and I wanted orange blossoms for my hair. My seamstress made an elegant opera cape for me, but also one that was very practical, that buttoned up to the chin and down to the toes for inclement weather. So Audie and I were married in Monroe, Michigan. 300 people attended, and this was the happiest day of my life. Another day in my life that was extremely happy was, of course, when the Civil War finally came to an end, and I received this very wonderful letter from George's commanding officer. My dear madam, I respectfully present to you the small writing table on which the conditions for the surrender of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia were written by Lieutenant General Grant. And permit me to say, madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who contributed more to bringing about this desirable result than your very gallant husband. Also, we were presented with 2 flags of truce and a button. The button was given to George by his old classmate, James Washington, and it is said to have come from the uniform of General George Washington. Being married to Audie was divine, and even being a widow was made glorious because of this gallant, heroic, patriotic man that I was blessed to be married to. I gave lectures about him because people were so interested. I wrote books, and it seemed like he never left me, and that his memory never would, and I hope his memory will not leave you also.
Lee, General Sheridan gives the desk the surrender to my wife, Libby. The last stand. June 25th, 1876, Little Bighorn. 200 of my men on that bank, overlooking that river, overwhelmed by the Sioux and Cheyenne. I was in my buckskin that day. My brothers to my right and left. Murderers. It was the end that afternoon. 200 of us mutilated, but not me. They found me in a little different scenario, which I'll talk about. But after I died, the news reached New York City. Not July 10th, New York Tribune. The massacre of Little Bighorn. Custer? General Custer? 200 men, the whole 7th, brutally murdered by the savage hostiles? It's true. It's true. My friend Whitman also wrote a sonnet for me. You're looking at the sonnet, the poem that my friend Walt Whitman wrote after my demise on that hill. If you permit me, I'll recite this for you. This is his handwritten copy. Walt was quite a guy. Look in the upper left, other right. Follow the script directly. Far from Montana's cannons, lands of the wild ravine, the dusky Sioux, the lonesome stretch, the silence, happily today, a mournful wail, happily a trumpet note for heroes. The battle bulletin, the Indian ambuscade, the slaughter and the environment, the cavalry companies fighting to the last, the fall of Custer, and all of his officers and men. Continues yet the old legend of our race, the loftiest of life upheld by death. The ancient banner perfectly maintained. Oh, lesson opportune, oh, how I welcome thee. As sitting in dark days, lone, sulky, through the time's thick murk, looking in vain for light, for hope from unsuspected parts, a fierce and momentary proof. The sun was there at the center. Though concealed, electric life forever at the center breaks forth a lightning flash. Though of sunny, flowing hair in battle, I erewhile saw, with erect head, pressing, ever in front, bearing this bright sword in thy hand, now ending the splendid fever of thy deeds. I bring no dirge for thee. I bring a glad, triumphant sonnet. There in the far northwest, in struggle, charge, saber smite, desperate and glorious, aye, in defeat most desperate, most glorious, after thy many battles, in which never giving up a gun or a color, leaving behind the memory, sweet to soldiers, thee yield a sunk, myself. Oh, Captain, my Captain. And ladies and gentlemen, you have just listened to the story of a legend. General George Armstrong Custer, Elizabeth Bacon Custer. In the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, the war between the states, the blue and the gray, the war of northern aggression, the war for southern independence. And we were reminded that 620,000 Americans died in those 4 years. And we, collectively, are inspired by that memory. The Union forever, the Union hurrah! Down with the traitors and up with the stars. Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys. We'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. I remain your humble servant, George Armstrong Custer. Now, you're welcome to come and have some photographs, and I'd love to speak with any of you about any Civil War history and Custer's life, and look at the artifacts table. It was an honor to be here this evening, and I hope you learned something, enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful evening. It's always wonderful to relive history.